This is a bit of a new experience for me. You can see me, but I can't see you. In the next 30 minutes or so, I want to tell you something about Remembrance Day and our armed forces. It's a very long story, and I can only touch on a very small part of it. Before I start, it might be worth remembering some of the more significant anniversaries that fall this year, such as Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, VE Day, and VJ Day. But I start with the cenotaph. It's a monument to someone buried elsewhere, especially one commemorating those who died in a war. The principal cenotaph in this country is in Whitehall, not far from the Houses of Parliament. It was unveiled on the 11th of November 1920, 2 years exactly after the guns had fallen silent at the end of the First World War. My story actually starts in 1839, when the United Kingdom, France and Prussia, that's the predecessor of the German Empire, signed the Treaty of London, which guaranteed Belgium sovereignty. 75 years later on the 3rd of August 1914, and after much unease in Europe, Germany invaded neutral Belgium. Mindful of our commitment to Belgium in the treaty, we declared war on Germany on the 4th of August 1914 because she had broken the terms of the treaty and had invaded Belgium. No sooner had war begun when men began to sign up to join either the army or the navy. The trained troops of the British Army were, meanwhile, soon on their way to the continent to join our French allies in stopping the German advance. And it wasn't just the men, women too. A great aunt of mine was sent to Belgium within days of the outbreak of war, and as a nurse took part in the Battle of Mons on the French-Belgian border. It was the first engagement of any note. Most troops arriving in France were, however, quite convinced the war would be over by Christmas, but were soon engaged with fighting the advancing German army. Before long, a sort of stalemate developed, and the two armies got bogged down on what became known as the Western Front, marked here by the red line. Whenever we think about the First World War, we conjure up a mental image of troops living and fighting in the trenches. This photograph gives you a feel for it. Note the soldiers asleep. Most attacks occurred at night, so they slept whenever they could. A feature of the war was the type of transport used. When war broke out, the army only had 80 mechanized vehicles. Most carrying and pulling in those days was done by horses. As you can imagine, transport was never very fast or easy, with horses having to pull guns and ammunition over appalling roads and tracks. And they all had to be fed, watered, and cared for. And during the entire war, some 500,000 horses were used. War will always expedite new inventions, and before long, fighting machines such as the tank and submarines and aircraft were participating in the conflict. The war was not, however, confined to the Western Front. It was a war being fought overseas and at sea. Here we have two Royal Navy battleships plunging their way into the North Sea in winter, and in the air. Now this picture shows the back end of a German airship called a Zeppelin, filled with hydrogen to make it lighter than air. The first ever air attack made on London occurred in May 1915 by a Zeppelin. It was now a people's war, and not just for those fighting elsewhere. Every so often there were specific offences and battles with names that have become familiar: Verdun, Passchendaele, Ypres, and perhaps the best remembered of all, the Somme. It took place between the 1st of July and the 18th of November 1916 on both sides of the upper regions of the river Somme in France. It was one of the most bitterly contested and costly battles of the war. There was hand-to-hand fighting, barbed wire, mines, artillery, and constant noise. It was one of the most bitterly contested and costly battles. On the first day alone, British forces suffered over 57,000 casualties, of whom nearly 20,000 were killed. Let me drag you away from the death and destruction of the Western Front and draw your attention to the one inescapable fact about Great Britain. We are an island. Everything we need that we can't produce ourselves has to reach us by sea. Germany knew this and realized she only had to cut the sea lanes to destroy our ability to survive and fight. We relied on our Navy, the Royal Navy, to defend us. It had underpinned our successes, both in home waters and overseas, for centuries, and now had to face a new and powerful new enemy, Germany. We sometimes forget that the war at sea was just as testing as that on land. Part of the Navy's strategy was to blockade Germany to prevent food, munitions, and raw materials reaching her shores by sea. It was done by laying mines and by naval ships patrolling the approaches to the North Sea to intercept and catch blockade evaders. Armed merchant ships were used extensively to support warships doing the same job. Germany had her own ideas about how to starve us into submission. By declaring a no-go zone or restricted area around our islands, any merchant ship detected trying to bring goods to Britain would be sunk when in the area marked on this map. Mines were laid in the shallow water, or submarines were used, known as U-boats. They would intercept and attack merchant ships. The preferred method of destruction was by gunfire. The alternative to the gun was by torpedo. And because most merchant ships sailed alone and were almost always slower than a surface U-boat, it was a remarkably successful campaign on their part. In the event, there was only one big ship pitched battle at sea during the entire war, the Battle of Jutland in the North Sea in May 1916. On the day, the Germans drew more blood, but in the longer term, they never ventured out again, and the big ship threat never returned. Meanwhile, the number of ships being sunk by U-boats and mines steadily grew, and each loss meant food or munitions, horses or fuel was being lost to the war effort. And by the beginning of 1917, we were very nearly on our knees and only had 6 weeks essential food left. And then certain individuals in London woke up to the fact that the answer was to sail ships in convoy with an escort. It was unbelievably successful, and almost overnight things got better. Now, I mentioned earlier that it was a world war and not just confined to France or the North Sea. Let me touch on one other campaign. We call it Gallipoli. Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, wanted to secure the trading route with Russia via the bit of water between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and also capture the Turkish capital at Constantinople. Once this had been achieved, it would be possible to open a supply route to Russia to enable it to wage war against Germany from the other side. The problem was to capture the bit of water that linked the two. Called the Dardanelles, with the peninsula of Gallipoli on one side, the campaign did not go well. The Navy could not get through because of mines, and the delay in doing something about it and building up sufficient troops with Australian and New Zealand help to capture Gallipoli took time. And by the time they eventually went ashore in April 1915, the Turks were ready for the troops, and when they were landing, they were cut down and never made any progress at all. By January 1916, it was all over, and the Allied troops withdraw. It was, in a nutshell, a complete failure. There were, however, 2 success stories to celebrate. Allied submarines from both the Royal Navy and the Royal Australian Navy managed to penetrate the Dardanelles and play havoc with Turkish shipping. And the second success was that the withdrawal was very carefully planned and was made without losing a single life. There were some extraordinary examples of bravery shown throughout the campaign, and some 38 Victoria Crosses were awarded for valour. Meanwhile, an event off the southern Irish coast was to turn the fortunes of the war. The Cunard liner Lusitania was on a wartime passage from New York to Liverpool in May 1915 when she was spotted and torpedoed by a U-boat. She sank in 18 minutes with a loss of 198 lives, including 123 Americans. The neutral USA was livid and protested vigorously to the Germans, who promised not to do it again. But in January 1917, Britain intercepted a diplomatic telegram between the German Foreign Office and its embassy in Mexico, proposing a military alliance between Germany and Mexico. Known as the Zimmermann telegram, after the Foreign Secretary of Germany, whose name was Zimmermann, it propelled America into the war. It declared war on Germany on the 6th of April 1917, not just because of the sinking of the Lusitania and the Zimmermann telegram, but because German U-boats were still sinking American merchant ships. It made all the difference, and within 18 months, Germany was on its knees. I'm going to pause very briefly for a moment, and before sweeping up the end of the First World War, I should perhaps mention one other event relevant to the creation of our armed forces. On the 1st of April 1918, the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps formed to create the Royal Air Force. Now, with America now on the side of Britain and France, the war dragged on until eventually Germany realized it couldn't win. Its people were starving because of the blockade, and there was a mutiny in the German Navy. This picture shows the aftermath of a shop in Germany that has just been looted. Germany finally decided to ask for peace, and on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns fell silent. The war was over. Formal peace wasn't concluded until the armistice had been signed in 1919 by the interested parties at the French Palace of Versailles, just outside Paris. The terms of the treaty were particularly harsh on Germany. Nobody realized it at the time, but it was so constraining on Germany that it inadvertently sowed the seeds for resurgent German nationalism and the outbreak of World War II. And 31 years later, World War II started after a massive arms build-up in Germany. The war was only a few hours old when the first blow was struck. A British passenger liner, the Athenia, was torpedoed and sunk by a U-boat off the north coast of Ireland, whilst on passage between Liverpool and Canada. With the declaration of war, British troops once again sailed to France to help the French. Nothing very much happened for a few months in a time that became known as the Phony War. But in April 1940, Germany made its move, and it moved fast. It first invaded and overran Denmark and Norway, and then turned on the Netherlands, Belgium and France. With lightning speed, the mechanized strength of the German armed forces swept all before it. The roads were clogged with fleeing refugees. And this sequence of pictures shows that they quickly began to push the Allies back towards the area around Calais and Dunkirk. It became quickly obvious that the British and French armies were trapped. They landed up on the port and the beaches of Dunkirk, and at virtually no notice at all, needed rescuing. The evacuation, known as the Miracle of Dunkirk, took off over 338,000 British and French troops from under the noses of the Germans. The only place that deep draft naval vessels could embark troops was alongside the Long Finger Mole, or the jetty, in the harbour, while fleets of small ships and boats were cobbled together at very short notice to take troops off the beaches. And it worked. With almost an army now in England, which has been defeated, Germany realized it had an opportunity to invade Britain and made its preparations. It concluded it first needed to destroy the Royal Air Force and set about bombing the nation's air defences. It then turned to bombing our industrial interests, factories, cities such as London. This picture of St. Paul's Cathedral is one of the most iconic pictures of the war, and its docks, particularly London docks. But the one thing it couldn't do was break the spirit of the British. Here we see civilians resting in a ready-made air raid shelter, the London Underground. But I think, as most of you know already, the one organisation it could not defeat was the Royal Air Force, which included Poles and Czechs and Australians and other Commonwealth countries among its pilots. And when it was over, the Prime Minister stood up in the House of Commons and said of them, "Never was so much owed by so few." Now, before I move on, I wonder what you would say if I asked you to write down your favorite 3 sounds. How many would think of the iconic sound of the Spitfire's Merlin engine? The defence of Britain had been in the hands of the Fighter Command, but the RAF fulfilled other roles, such as offensive bombing of targets in Germany. Perhaps the best known is the attack made on dams in the Ruhr Valley. Known as the Dam Busters, 617 Squadron carried out the attack in mid-May of 1943 with 19 Lancaster bombers. The attack was made with some precision, flying at night, and the aircraft had to fly at exactly 240 miles an hour and at 60 feet above the water. Any error and the bouncing bomb would miss the target. The raid was a success. It interrupted Germany's industrial ability for a while and deprived a nearby canal of its headwater. Meanwhile, our position as an island was under considerable strain. As in World War I, Germany's U-boats were exacting a terrible strain on the supply routes to and from Britain, and ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. We called it the Battle of the Atlantic, and it was the longest-running campaign of the war. The U-boats had evolved a means of attack called the Wolf Pack, whereby they would patrol as a group and with sufficient intelligence would aim to intercept a convoy and ideally attack the defenseless merchant ships from the surface at night. It was a devastating tactic. Despite learning the lessons of the First World War with ships sailing in large convoys, it seems Germany always had the upper hand. Bad weather had advantages that the U-boats found it difficult to find their quarry, but we couldn't count on that. It was left to the naval escorts to somehow catch their foe in these difficult circumstances, and their essential task was to get the merchant ships to their destination intact. It wasn't easy. We never had enough escorts, and the range of aircraft was too limited. The U-boats knew this and patrolled in areas where the aircraft of the day could not reach them. This picture shows a Canadian corvette, the workhorse of the battle on the Allied side. And if you look at the top of the mast, you will see a crow's nest with a lookout. Must have been very cold. This was the days before radar. And then in 1943, our luck changed. Longer range aircraft were introduced. Ships were equipped with radar. We had better tactics, and we had some brilliant at-sea commanding officers. We managed to capture a model of the German signal encryption machine called Enigma. And some brilliant minds managed to break the code using early computers at a place called Bletchley Park near Milton Keynes. And as a result, we were able to divert convoys around the waiting U-boat packs and home in to destroy them. Our ability to read German top-secret signals was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. And now to a different part of the world. On December the 7th, 1940, Honolulu in Hawaii, part of the United States of America, was suddenly and deliberately attacked by Japan. The USA was taken completely by surprise. In 1941, the United States entered World War II as Congress declared war against Japan a day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Hitler announced the declaration of war against the United States on the 11th of December, 1941. America's entry into the war resulted in a range of activities, including regaining lost territory. It involved, amongst other things, moving troops around the world by ships such as the Cunard liner Queen Elizabeth. During her war service as a troop ship, she carried more than 750,000 troops and sailed some 500,000 miles. She could have as many as 6,000 troops on board at a time. Now, the first objective in recapturing land was to invade French-held North Africa in an operation called Torch, beginning in November 1942. This was because the French government centered on Vichy France-held pro-Nazi Germany views, and we also wanted to curtail German and Italian occupation in both Libya and Tunisia. He presented a major threat to the importance of the Suez Canal, which we were trying to protect. The landings and subsequent fighting took place at the end of 42 and into 43. Before moving on to the east, the British had begun fighting on the joint German and Italian armies in North Africa for 2 years, with mixed success, and the North African landings were designed to bring extra pressure on the enemy. The landings went well, and the Allies advanced eastwards. Desert warfare was very different from that fought in Northern Europe, with searing temperatures and long lines of communications on both sides. The German-Italian forces, known collectively as the Axis, were under the command of the very capable General Rommel, while the British forces on the Egyptian side of the battle area was General Montgomery, and the scene was set for a major confrontation. But before I return to the North African campaign, let me divert to the one British base in the middle of the Mediterranean, Malta. Malta was a base from which British ships, submarines and aircraft could and did attack Axis supply convoys, sailing from Italy and Greece to both Tunisia and Libya. It was a major thorn in the enemy's side, and between 1940 and 42, the Axis laid siege to Malta with air and naval forces and destroyed a large part of the infrastructure. But despite huge damage to Malta and constant attacks on the convoys attempting to supply the island, sufficient supplies were delivered and Malta survived. This picture shows the oil tanker Ohio arriving in Malta with some desperately needed fuel oil. Throughout this time, the Axis forces in North Africa were totally dependent on their own convoys getting through to provide fuel, munitions, food, and the paraphernalia of war, and the British were equally determined to stop them. One of the most successful means of attacking these convoys were by the submarines of the 10th Submarine Flotilla operating out of Malta. Despite having to find their way blind through the enemy minefields that surrounded the island, these small submarines wrought havoc with the enemy. And combined with the air attacks and the cruisers of Force K, also operating out of Malta, they deprived Rommel of almost everything he needed. Their rolling cutting Rommel supplies coincided with the ultimate British victory over the Axis forces at the Second Battle of Alamein on the 23rd of October 1942. The Allied forces' victory was the beginning of the end of the Western Desert Campaign, limiting the Axis threat to Egypt and the Suez Canal and the Middle East and Persian oil fields beyond. Now I wonder how many of you recognize this flag and can identify the cross in the corner. It is the flag of Malta, and the cross is the George Cross, uniquely given to the people of Malta by King George VI in April 1942 for their heroic stand against a determined enemy. From Malta now to the adjacent and larger island of Sicily, in which both Germans and Italians were stationed. Of even greater significance were the airfields from which the enemy could operate with near impunity. And Sicily was the next objective for Allied landings and as a prelude to retaking Italy. The landings were scheduled to take place in mid-July 1943, and this picture shows troops coming ashore on the opening day. The landings were successful, with many valuable lessons learned from the North African campaign. But the biggest and most important landings were still a year off. The main invasion of Europe, planned for the summer of 1944. The planning for the invasion of Europe was the most complex task facing the Allied staffs. Where to invade? When to invade? How many troops? Intelligence to be obtained, deception plans to be hatched, and above all, security and secrecy was paramount. If one word leaked out about the real intentions, everything would be lost. Now, I don't have enough time to tell you about the preparations, but I will very briefly touch on just one very small part: sabotage. I wonder if anybody knows what this aircraft is and what it did in the war. It is called a Lysander, and it had one very valuable asset. It could land and take off in very short distances, at night and on small landing areas. And note the ladder just behind the nearest wing. It was flown by the RAF from Tangmere in Sussex near Chichester. to fields in France, and with one or two, very occasionally three, passengers on board. They were the members of the Special Operations Executive, trained to support the resistance in France in the lead up to D-Day. The agents included some incredibly brave women, all fluent in French, to prepare for the invasion to come. They might carry wireless sets or messages to the resistance leaders and expertise in numerous difficult trades. And if captured, as many were, they were on their own, and several lost their lives. The pilots navigated by moon, shining on the rivers and lakes in France. They would land on a miniature and pre-arranged landing ground, marked by 3 torches, and they would spend just 3 minutes on the ground to disembark outbound agents and pick up those returning to the United Kingdom. The basic aim was to ensure that there were people on the ground who could blow up railways, bridges, and telecommunications links at the same time as the invasion forces landed. It worked, and the Germans suddenly found that their pre-planned routes had suddenly been destroyed when most needed. And while on the subject of clandestine operations, there was a branch of military intelligence with a very different role. It was hardly a night when a bombing raid was not being planned over both Germany and France. Many bombers returned safely, but not all. Some were shot down and crashed. The aircrew of others might have time to bail out and open their parachutes. But every man who survived depleted the ranks of trained aircrew, but he was in the wrong place. And every effort was made to get them back home. The lucky ones would make contact with somebody who had access to one of the escape and evasion lines, marked here on this map. Run by the French with British support, they would be escorted to, or the airmen would be escorted to a place where they could be picked up or crossing a border to a neutral country. And just look at the line that crosses the channel at the top of the map shown there. Escaping or evading aircrew would be taken in the middle of the night to a beach in Brittany, and this is the actual beach, and in complete silence, and would be picked up by motor gunboat and taken across the channel to either the Isles of Scilly, the Helford River in Cornwall, or Dartmouth. Back to the planning. The Allies decided on Normandy as the invasion point at the end of 1943 and set a date for May 1944. United States General Dwight Eisenhower was appointed as Supreme Allied Commander. He had an extremely testing job, and he had to get it right. Perhaps the most difficult decision of all was the decision to go on the date planned. This is the weather map for the 5th of June 1944. It forecast the most awful weather and could completely destroy months of planning. And given the information, he decided to postpone the invasion by 24 hours. And some of the ships were already en route, and they all had to be told. You might wonder what ship was the first to arrive off the landing beaches. The answer is a mini-submarine. X-20 and X-23, each with a crew of 5, acted as navigational beacons to help the D-Day invasion fleet land on the correct beaches with lights and beacons. The space on board for just 5 people was pretty limited. As we now know, the landings on the 6th of June were on the whole a huge success, with some parts proving to be relatively easy and others incredibly hard, with a determined enemy trying to prevent them. Nearly 160,000 troops crossed the English Channel that first day, and more than 2 million Allied troops were in France by the end of August. Once the initial landings had taken place, the planners had foreseen the need for heavy goods and fuel lines. An artificial harbour was built, and a pipeline called Pluto was laid across the channel to provide fuel for the mechanized transport and armour. This map shows that it wasn't just seaborne troops that landed, but many came in gliders or were parachuted in. Once again, I'm racing through the narrative as the invasion forced their way through France and Belgium in order to occupy Germany. Enemy soldiers were captured en route and had to be disarmed and taken care of. And then there was a plan for a high-speed dash to capture bridges over the rivers and canals in the Netherlands. Called Market Garden and using airborne troops, it failed for a whole range of reasons, but the objective was to secure a bridgehead over the River Rhine to create an invasion route into Germany. And one of the main reasons was the lead units went too far and too fast for the support side to keep up behind it. This is one of the 9 bridges the Allies tried to capture. Among the consequences of that operation failing was that great swathes of the Netherlands were not freed from the tyranny of the German occupation through what was a terrible few months in 1945. Many of the Dutch civilians died through what became known as the Hunger Winter. It was among the low points of the entire war. But come 1945, the end was not far off. 1.5 million prisoners taken on the Western Front in April 1945 and early May. Germany eventually surrendered. It was a victory in Europe and the people rejoiced. The headlines were full of it. And the royal family, together with the architect of victory, Mr. Winston Churchill, came out on the balcony of Buckingham Palace and acknowledged the cheers of the nation. But the war was not over. In the Pacific, it was still continuing. The Pacific War was very different to the North Atlantic and European one. Fought over vast distances and hopping from island to island, it was largely an American conflict with some help from their British, Australian, New Zealand, Dutch and Chinese allies. Many names will be unfamiliar to our ears, but meant much to the American people and those living in the Pacific region, such as Midway, Guam and the Coral Sea. It was a war fought largely by aircraft flying from aircraft carriers and hand-to-hand fighting in the islands and the jungles ashore. For the British, the memories are very different. After the ignominy of having to surrender Singapore in February 1942, the British found themselves fighting a very determined and very able Japanese army trying to fight their way into Burma to capture its natural resources and hopefully make it into India as well. And Burma has 1,200 miles of coastline. Burma is among the most difficult countries in the world to fight in. Jungle, mountain ridges, rivers, few roads or railways, tropical monsoons, cloudy, rainy, hot, humid summers, exhausting landscape. The country's highlands are home to elephants, rhinoceros, wild buffaloes and monkeys. The rivers and creeks contain saltwater crocodiles, and everywhere pythons, cobras and other reptiles, and every type of insect and leech to keep you awake at night. The capital, Rangoon, fell to the Japanese in early March 1942. The Japanese fought their way north with the Allied troops, finding it nearly impossible to prevent the advance, destroying much of the infrastructure as they went. The conditions for fighting this enemy were unbelievably difficult, and the Japanese troops were very clever and almost impossible to see on the ground. The Allies retreated into India, crossing rivers one minute and mountain ridges the next. And then this man took command, General Bill Slim, arguably the most brilliant soldier of the entire war. He took over with defeat facing them and changed everything. Now, I haven't got time to discuss the Burmese campaign, but suffice to say the fortunes of the Allies were reversed at places in India called Kohima and Imphal. Defeat was turned into victory, and the Japanese were now the enemy in retreat. Now, there's one other narrative I will very briefly touch on. The Japanese made many Allied soldiers and sailors and airmen prisoners of war, particularly when Singapore fell. Many of the prisoners were set to work on constructing the infamous 258-mile-long Burma Railway, connecting Thailand with central Burma. Between 180,000 and 250,000 prisoners of war were subjected to forced labor during its construction, and about 16,000 died. Now, although by the summer of 1945 Japan was staring defeat in the eyes, it refused to give up. And then, out of a clear blue sky, the United States just detonated 2 nuclear weapons over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August the 6th and 9th. And although many people, mainly civilians, died in the attack, it brought the war to an abrupt end, and the nuclear option has never had to be used since. The Japanese capitulated on the 15th of August, which is now VJ Day, and formally signed the surrender document on the 2nd of September on board the US battleships Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. The relief for the world was enormous. And one person showed that relief together with many, many millions. And that person was my father, who was serving in the battleship King George V, which had been the flagship of the Pacific Fleet. The world cheered. The troops came home and were slightly surprised to find that many people had forgotten them. Which brings my gallop through 2 world wars to an end, and all we are left with are the memorials and, sadly, the cemeteries where people were buried overseas. We have the graves to remember them, and I've wondered how to link that story with what is going on today. My father, who has been serving in the Pacific, had actually spent the early parts of the war flying in Swordfish aircraft from aircraft carriers. But me, I have my own ration book, and this is it. So people in those days had very little to eat. And in 1949, age 7, my father was attached to the Australian Navy, and we all went out there by sea. We came home in this ship, the Himalaya, a big white vessel, and I was completely smitten by going to sea. This is me, age 13, wearing my first naval uniform. It was the first time I'd ever been called sir by anybody, and I was absolutely thrilled. But I left school and went into the merchant navy, and I joined this ship, cargo ship trading to Australia. I spent a year on board her and then switched to one going to the Far East, the Singapore. It was a marvelous way to see the Far East. This is Shanghai before the skyscrapers arrived. We loaded many cargoes, including rubber and tin, and I got to know about how trade worked and the amount of material being carried around the world. And I finished up on another ship going to Australia. Before I had a rush of blood to the head, and I joined the Royal Navy, and I went to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. I did my training partly in ships trading or going to the Canary Islands and the Caribbean, which is not a bad place to learn. I spent a year in the Persian Gulf in a small minesweeper, learned a lot about the Middle East. And then I joined submarines, very old wartime submarines, but it was a most marvelous training ground. I enjoyed submarines, great comradeship, very grotty on board, little to wash, very hot. But I went out to Singapore in one of these submarines, and I was there for nearly 2 years. I achieved command at sea, age 29, and the rank of lieutenant. And then I was promoted, and I commanded a nuclear submarine carrying nuclear weapons. And later still, I was in command of a frigate on the surface, which is probably the most exciting job I had. I loved it, and I had my own helicopter, which once flew over Martyr Worthy here. Some of my guests on board were slightly unusual. Here we have Princess Diana. But I was unique in having the largest crew of any ship in the world. I don't know how many of you have been beavers, or your fathers were. But every beaver, when I was in command, was made an honorary member of my ship's company. And at one stage, I had a ship's company of 26,000 young beavers. I went ashore after that and served in various staffs. And one opportunity I had was to go to the North Pole in an aircraft, and I watched 2 submarines surface there. As an Admiral, I was in charge of intelligence analysis, which took me all around the world. This is a picture of me in Pakistan discussing Afghanistan. And you might well ask, did I ever get involved in conflict? The answer was no, but I was on the periphery of several. Aden, there was an insurrection there. And I spent a few days there and witnessed an oil dump being blown up. Aden is on the south part of the Arabian Peninsula. Later still, Indonesia. We deployed to Singapore to take part in it, but it came to an end before I reached there. But Indonesia took objection to the creation of the Malay states. There was a lot of jungle warfare even then. And then there was the Falklands Campaign in 1982. Again, I didn't take part in it, but I was in London working on the staff. Falklands was probably the most formidable task we'd ever had, and demonstrated yet again how short notice some conflicts can be. This is Port Stanley, the headquarters, or part of the capital of the islands. A naval campaign anyway, everything had to go by sea. And we lost some very formidable ships, and our troops had to walk across the islands in order to beat the Argentinians. And then finally, of course, we had our Afghanistan, which I was not part of. This happened after I left. But an amazing place, very beautiful country in many ways. I felt so sorry for the people there who were having to cope with this awful war going on around them. And the troops going there didn't go by troop ships, but were crammed into aircraft, such as this big transport. And that's how they got there in just a few hours. And this really brings me what we do today as part of the armed forces in the world. This map shows in the blue where we are actually operating or have troops stationed. We are essentially part of NATO, which is an alliance whereby we join with places like United States, Canada, Norway, Germany, Italy, and the rule is that an attack on one is an attack on all. So just to finish up with the sort of work that our armed forces do today. We could be peacekeeping anywhere in the world. We could be looking after some of the people, training their troops to guard against insurrection. We could be flying to provide relief after some disaster. And this also happens from the Navy. And we deploy to the Caribbean for hurricanes afterwards and helping the citizens. Helping citizens after a disaster is one of the most attractive things we do. Very difficult, very rewarding. And the women take part as well as the men. You'll see on the right here is somebody working with the United Nations. And this soldier here is actually a woman. Gives you an idea how much has changed. Royal Marines landing as part of their training. The nuclear submarines still carry ballistic missiles, and this is one of the Valiant class. The RAF still deploy around the world, sometimes at very short notice, to support some United Nations resolution. And of course we have the ceremonial. Very, very proud moment to march on Horse Guards Parade for Trooping the Colour, or with the Royal Marine bands. And some of the musicians who take part in that are very highly qualified musicians, not only play trumpets and drums, but also classical music instruments. And all the time, our ships are deployed around the world, which really brings our story very nearly to the end. All I can say is the armed forces is an extraordinary career, which I have enjoyed. Wonderful opportunity to do things that nobody else can possibly hope to do. Never know what's going to happen tomorrow. And I've had a wonderful insight into what's going on in the world. Which brings us back to Remembrance Sunday. And this year, for the first time in 100 years, we've not been able to celebrate it in the usual way because of COVID. But nevertheless, I hope I've given you a feel for what the armed forces have done in the past and are doing today. And I leave you with a poem to look at, which sums up what we're trying to achieve. Thank you very much.